The truth is that nuclear will absolutely be too late to help us with climate. And of course, it's far too expensive.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to probably the most unexpected episode in the history of the Smarter E podcast. Today, we'll talk about the return of nuclear power. In preparation for our irregular topic today, I actually learned that the building of nuclear power reactors had already peaked in the 1970s. Just to put this into perspective, I'm 39 years old already, and I wasn't even born yet when the industry around building nuclear power reactors had already begun to go into decline. Hence, informally, I call this episode The Wake of a Long Dead Zombie. Nevertheless, we have to face reality. Some billionaires around the world, in the US and Poland, but most importantly some governments, such as for example France and the EU, seem to think that nuclear power is the most important puzzle piece in satisfying an ever-growing energy need while facing climate crisis and having to keep CO2 emissions at a minimum. And somehow they manage to wiggle nuclear power into the EU taxonomy. No question, here at the Smarter E, we are strongly biased when it comes to this topic because, of course, we are all for renewable energies. Hence, we wanted to speak to somebody who is not from our industry, but actually spent his life researching nuclear power and radiation risks and consulting government officials. I'm very much looking forward to hear his insights into already the least unforeseen debate of 2022. Welcome to the Smarter E podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized and digital, bringing together electricity, heat and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome Paul Dorfman as my guest for today's topic. Because Paul is an absolute expert on our subject. He's an associate fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex Business School. He's a member of the Irish Government Radiation Protection Advisory Committee, and he is the chair of the Nuclear Consulting Group, a group that brings together key experts who have all worked at the front line of the nuclear issue and who have all been involved at the highest government nuclear regulatory and radiation protection levels in the US, in Germany, in France, and in the UK. And jointly, they actually just recently published a communiqué because they've all come to the agreement that nuclear is just not part of any feasible strategy that could counter climate change. Well, I'm extremely thrilled that Paul took his time today to join us and explain to us the absolutely sound and well-researched facts and arguments that brought them to this conclusion. Such a pleasure to have you with us, Paul.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, Paul, I guess to you being so deep into the matter, the debate that we suddenly have here in Europe might not have come as surprisingly as it did to us. But not for you, but just for our listeners out there. Just before I ask my first question, I have to throw out a couple of more facts that are just mind-blowing to me. It's that the French power organization, EDF, which was one of the most important organizations in building nuclear reactors in France, probably still is what at its heydays, the company was worth $80 per share. At the moment, they're down to 10 and have been so for a long, long time. Also, French reactors only have an operational rate of around about 60 to 70%, which is in comparison, for example, to American reactors, which are at a steady rate of 90%. Absolutely a poor performance. So how, when you know this, is it that now in the coming French election in this year, all of the presidential candidates have announced the construction of several new pressurized water reactors of the EPR type? How come France is doing so poorly in nuclear and still wants to have a new go at it?
It's a very interesting question. And in that sense, I think it needs to be understood in the context of the French electoral campaign. If Macron is re-elected, he's there till 2027. And according to him, no new reactor build would start up even before 2028. And in fact, he just about said there's no true revival of nuclear, but, quote, the necessity of maintaining at least some projects designed to maintain the whole filière, the whole sort of group of nuclear float. And when one thinks about the French nuclear group afloat, one also thinks about submarines and its associated warheads. So Macron also says he expects some EU money for new reactors, and whatever happens with the taxonomy, that's just simply wishful thinking. Now, of the 6 new EPRs, those French reactors that Macron says he'll build, the starting price, he says, is about 50 billion euros. Now, given what we know about these reactors, all of the history in Finland, in France, in China, in Olkiluoto, Flamanville, Taishan, we know that this price will at least double to about 100 billion. And if we're really concerned about climate, the reality is, of course, it won't produce any new energy until what, 2040, 2050? So, in summary, EDF nuclear finances are quite simply, as you've stated, out of control. EDF stock is downgraded in the stock market. All EDF EPR reactors are hugely overcost and over time everywhere they're being built. And there could be a possible key generic safety fault in the EPR RPV, the reactor pressure vessel, the main safety component of any reactor that seems to come out of the only functioning or had been functioning EPR reactor in Taishan, which now has been shut down for many, many months. So in answer to your question, yes, it's kind of difficult. It's a kind of a sort of almost a Trump-esque world here. I think it can be more or less reflects Macron's position in the context of next year's election.
All right, that puts it into perspective already a little bit. So we're not talking about an effort to revive nuclear power and bring it back to its heydays 30 or 40 years ago. It's more maintaining a certain level, a certain base load, also maintaining, of course, the nuclear fleet, which might have some legit reasons behind it. But still, 100 billion is so much money that obviously could also be invested elsewhere. So how does that compare in pricing in regards to renewable energy?
Okay, let's start with that. So Lazard, and one understands Lazard is a very straightforward accounting of where we are with energy. Just a few months ago, in terms of megawatt hour, comes out solar is about 29 euros per megawatt hour, land wind about 33 euros per megawatt hour, CCS gas 52 euros per megawatt hour, coal 94 euros per megawatt hour, with large nuclear, rather like the French EPR, at 145 euros per megawatt hour.
All right, so that makes nuclear round about 5 times more expensive than PV. And I guess the big difference being here that with that kind of money, PV could massively be deployed in the coming years already, versus for the nuclear power, we, as you said, would have to wait almost 20 years until 2040, right?
And that's the point. I mean, the point here is clearly climate. And the point is that we need to act soon. Nuclear is simply too late. I mean, since 2009, solar costs fell by 90%, wind by 70%, nuclear increased by 33%. So we're not simply talking about cost here. We're talking about time to deployment in the context of climate. And the truth is that nuclear will absolutely be too late to help us with climate. And of course, it's far too expensive.
It's too expensive and it would be far too late. And still, somehow they managed to wiggle it into the EU taxonomy. So before we talk about how they did that or why that happened, maybe let's just have a light at the EU taxonomy, because myself, but probably also some listeners out there, are not that well versed when it comes to EU legislation and the exact role of the EU taxonomy. So just quickly enlighten us, what is the EU taxonomy about and why is it so important in that context?
The EU taxonomy is relatively important. What the EU taxonomy tries to designate energy production for encouragement of investment, basically, and to say whether that energy production is either green, in other words, sustainable, or non-green, in other words, non-sustainable. And the key issue here is the do no harm caveat, so that if it does harm, it is obviously unsustainable. And there's been a long discussion within the EU about this, with the technical expert group, which was the key group that studied it, saying essentially that no, there were some significant doubts as to whether nuclear was sustainable. And then the EU, in its normal kind of way, pushed it on to a sort of a number of other technical groups, and has recently announced, to everyone's astonishment, that somehow nuclear is, as it were, sustainable, and that the do no harm caveat, the key do no harm caveat, doesn't apply in nuclear. In other words, nuclear does no harm. And this is particularly problematic in terms of accidents, incidents, and of course, waste. And the European Commission's own Science Committee on Health, Environment and Energy said that the conclusion, the JRC, the sort of the final technical conclusion, which said that there's no evidence of harm, is not sufficiently supported by information, and that waste remains an open question with considerable uncertainty. So, in a sense, it's a very, very problematic decision by the EU, which already has attracted huge comeback.
Let's dive into that for just a second. So, I mean, of course, it's obvious that a nuclear power reactor does not seem to emit as much CO2 as, for example, a coal-fired power plant. That I think I understand as a non-expert as well. But there's so many other risks. So how did the proponents then actually argue for the do not harm principle? In what way were they able to make it fit that criteria?
Essentially, the criteria was fitted with a kind of two further caveats, that each country had to have in place a sort of an ongoing waste disposal program by, I think, 2050, and also to use so-called sort of safer fuel mechanisms. Now, the problem with both of those is that, firstly, at the moment, there is no such thing as waste disposal. There's simply waste storage, waste management. There's a few holes that are dug and a few are advanced, but there's absolutely no proof of principle of disposal for high-level waste, the deeply problematic high-level waste, and even intermediate waste. In terms of the so-called safer fuels, that too is at an experimental basis and may not come to pass. So essentially, it's a kind of a political game that's been played out with France in the forefront.
So there's no workable plan in place for the actual disposal of nuclear waste in the long run. And that just means we talk about the nuclear waste that is being created in a planned fashion and, if everything goes well. But what about all the unaccountable risks? What about flood risks or the positioning of nuclear power plants near waters and rising sea levels? Has anything changed in that regard? Are we at a different technical level with new reactors?
Okay, I mean, post-Fukushima, one understands very much more about the so-called beyond design-based cascading risks. In other words, all of the nuclear accidents and incidents that have happened are beyond design-based. They wasn't thought of in the design. Essentially, accidents are, of course, accidental. So what happens, quite rightly, in terms of the nuclear industry, is try to lessen the probability of accidents by trying to put in more safety features. The result is basically you've got reactors that are increasingly complex and increasingly difficult to build. And the truth is you really can't design out an accident. And the problem with a nuclear accident is that when and if it goes wrong, and now we're seeing it go wrong about once every 20 years for a very big accident, it really does affect a lot of people's lives, and it really does cost a huge amount of money. Now, when one's thinking about what will happen in terms of climate change, we understand more and more that there will be increasing climate impact, and that climate impact will also impact a nuclear plant. Nuclear has to be beside large bodies of water, the sea or river, in order to intake water to cool the reactor and also to discharge. Now, we know what's going to happen with the coast. The coasts will rise, there'll be storm surge, there'll be flooding. We know what's going to happen to the rivers. They will alternate between low and high flow. And we also know what's going to happen with inundation, which we've seen across Europe this year. So there are very significant climate risks that are set to impact nuclear reactors, both old and new. So the notion that nuclear will help us with climate seems to be profoundly problematic. And the probability that within maybe 2 decades we will have significant problems with our current and any new nuclear reactors.
So not much has changed in that regard, as I understand. One thing that I would like to ask you specifically is that small modular reactors, because that seems to be quite the craze. There's like some American billionaires, even some Polish billionaires, who seem to have made it their pet project to bring some of these seemingly very small reactors into the world. It seems to come more like with a startup approach. So is that like a completely different technology, or is it just the same but smaller?
It's the same but smaller. And the point about SMRs, SMRs have been around for a long time in terms of submarine propulsion. And they've never really worked out. They've never been put into business in terms of civil nuclear, because the whole of the history of nuclear has always been built on bigger is better because of economies of scale, which is the same for most things, including wind turbines. So the idea about small modular reactors is that you lose the economies of scale, and you gain the so-called idea of modularization, this sort of factory run, as it were. The problem is in setting up this factory run is going to be, would be hugely expensive. To set up a huge sort of supply chain network to build this modularization, and the economic risk of doing so is phenomenal. Now, the only way you can do that is if you have hundreds of orders on your books already. Now, if you have hundreds, where are you going to sell them to? Where are you going to try to sell them to developing nations who won't have the infrastructure to keep these places safe, and also will add exponentially to proliferation problems? The further problems with SMRs is that they cost exactly the same as new reactors per kilowatt hour. And per kilowatt hour is the key here. So they'll cost the same per energy. The experience in nuclear with modularization is not good, is actually pretty lousy, because if you make one mistake in the supply chain, you can stuff up the end product. And that's happened time and time again. SMRs produce the same radiation waste as large reactors per kilowatt hour. And also there's severe security and safety problems with this sort of coupling of the reactor core and the containment, which you'd have to do because you've got this sort of relatively small unit. And as I've discussed before, this notion of SMRs providing a sort of breakout proliferation potential for developing nations. So in short, this business about sort of small is beautiful and all the rest of it, it's a lot down to PR. And there are, no matter what, neoliberal billionaires say, the development of SMRs is still way behind.
Well, all right. So it is not cheaper. It is not safer. The radiation risks in some are the same. And as you said, there's even more problems if something goes wrong in the supply chain, because you multiply the problem. That is some staggering insights, to be honest, Paul. And I think another interesting fact is that there's just not a big track record of running SMRs. So please correct me here, but I think there's only one SMR running up to date in Europe. Is that right?
There is no SMR running in Europe. Really running. Okay, so a lot of this is PR. And in terms of proof of principle, say in the UK says, for example, it wants a so-called SMR, the Rolls-Royce SMR, as it were. But the reality, it's not an SMR. An SMR, you'd say, is about 300 megawatts or less. The plan for UK, supposedly, its SMR that it's putting hundreds of millions into, is about nearly up to 470, near 500 megawatts. That's nearly half the size of a full-grown reactor. So you can see where this is heading. Basically, this business about SMRs being small and effective comes across this huge block in the context of economies of scale. And despite the huge PR associated with SMRs, they look profoundly problematic.
It sounds more like a relabeling effort, which brings us back to the EU taxonomy. Like, if the taxonomy stays as it is at the moment, what would be the consequence? Would that mean really all of this sort of money going in this direction and then being not available for renewable energies? What would be the real world consequences?
Real world, not necessarily. The market has said no to nuclear. Everywhere you go, the market says no. There's simply no question about it. Nuclear is quite simply impractical. It is economic, and that's what the market says. Nobody invests in nuclear. The only investment in nuclear is in command and controlled economies public state-owned economies, Russia, China, and a few other sort of bits and bobs associated with Russia and China. The UK did quite frankly, appalling kind of deal with EDF in terms of trying to construct Hinkley Point, but is now going for a sort of a form of public subsidy for any potential further construction. So the reality is this. The market has said no to nuclear. The only way that you construct nuclear of any breed is for the public purse to take the huge and ramping hit. Now, the whole point about the taxonomy is to incentivize investment. It's kind of puzzling as to who may or would invest in EU nuclear in the market, because basically the market had said no.
So does that make it a purely theoretical debate? Because, we could just say, let them include it into the EU taxonomy because there's not going to be anybody financing these schemes anyway? Or is it that this just allows then some EU funds to be dedicated to nuclear power?
In terms of the EU, there are various positions, Germany, France, different states within the EU take different positions. But the EU itself, and in terms of what's happening in Brussels, there has been to be honest, there has been a pro-nuclear bias for quite some time amongst the sort of glitterati of the EU. So this inclusion is not unexpected. In terms of what really will happen, it won't impact the market. It won't affect the market. It could affect the financial, fiscal, dexterous jiggery-pokery around public subsidy of nuclear. And we're seeing that in the UK in terms of the RAB, the regulated asset base model, which essentially puts all of UK nuclear electricity consumers and taxpayers in the front line of paying for nuclear.
What numbers are we talking about there? Is it a significant number, these subsidies?
They would be, because they're not enacted yet. They would be massive. They would be, and not only that, but also there's the various complexities about when the UK public would start to pay for these cost overruns and who would be left holding the baby.
Wow, so that makes it even worse. So what you're saying is that a technology that would not survive by itself in the free market here is trying to be pushed onto the taxpayer, right?
Totally. I mean, look, total investment in a new renewable electricity, the latest figures we have is about 2020, going on for early 2021, about $300 billion. That's 17 times the reported global investment in nuclear. Now, renewables provide are highly resilient, and so that's about 256 gigawatts of non-hydro, and I say non-hydro renewables, were added to the world's power grids in 2020.
So just to put it quickly into perspective, what's the ratio then of renewables being employed versus nuclear being employed?
Well, wind added 111 gigawatts, solar 127 gigawatts, nuclear added 0.4 gigawatts. So one sees exactly what's going on here. I mean, 256 gigawatts to play against 0.4 gigawatts is an astonishing number. And when one looks at the IEA, the International Energy Authority, their predictions are 2021 renewables provide 290 gigawatts. They say 2026, 4,800 gigawatts. Which is a phenomenal increase, equivalent to current total fossil fuel and nuclear combined.
Usually then one argument, I guess, proponents of nuclear power would bring in there is that, but renewables are so unreliable. Sun doesn't shine at night and wind sometimes doesn't blow. So apart from the actual, from the potential power being installed versus then the actual output per time of renewables, is that an important, factor?
Okay, at the moment, nearly 20% of French nuclear fleet is offline. It's down because of safety problems. So this notion of nuclear being on all the time is fallacious. Now, the reality is one knows, in Europe, renewables overtook fossil fuels to become the primary source of power in 2020, and non-hydro renewables generated more power than nuclear. So the reality is, everybody knows, everybody understands this, is that the renewable evolution is here. This is where the market is. This is where energy future is. This is what's going on. The argument then devolves to nuclear as a backup to this idea of so-called intermittency and so-called baseload. Now, the problem with nuclear is that it's very bad at what one understands, what was called load following, another sort of backup. In other words, powering up and powering down, because largely what it does is you switch it on and it goes. So firstly, it's not at all good at doing what it says it sort of wants to do on the box. It's not at all good at backing up what we now know will happen, which is the renewable evolution. And then one gets into complex discussions about issues around baseload, and the former head of UK National Grid said baseload is an outdated concept. And increasingly, this notion of renewables as intermittent. When one thinks about energy, one doesn't simply think about electricity, or more and more one thinks about electricity, but one thinks about energy in the round. So you're talking about supply, and now we're just talking about supply with nuclear. One talks about transport of power, one talks about its use, one talks about energy management, one talks about energy efficiency, one talks about a whole host of issues about storage, about stockage, about interconnectors, load balancing over long distances. So when one gets into the core discussion about energy, which is a hugely complex discussion, nuclear continues to be an absolute sideline, a hugely costly sideline. And going forward, thinking in the future, there are solutions to all of our energy and electricity issues in obtaining net zero in the future.
All right, so even if we're just talking about using nuclear to complement a decentralized renewable energy grid that has fluctuations, would make it a less than ideal complementation because it's just so bad and quickly being powered up and down. Well, the EU taxonomy is not only about nuclear, they're also trying to include gas. What about gas then? Because there seems to be sort of a different opinion here. Germany, for example, is on the one hand against classifying nuclear power as sustainable, but they're all right with gas-fired power plants and think they should be considered bridge technology and hence climate-friendly investment. So would you personally rather than have natural gas than nuclear power? Are they both equally bad? What's your stance here?
I mean, look, clearly natural gas has problems, and also one understands politically what's happening now, and also why nuclear proponents are so on their high horse at the moment, which is precisely because of what's happening with gas. And clearly natural gas is costly per megawatt hour, and hugely costly per megawatt hour, and also provides significant CO2, which is something that is deeply problematic. The point about the energy transition is that we need to transition, and we need to be clear about this, and we need to be honest and practical about how we do this. In other words, we need to be stepwise. And in the same way that Germany is stepwise significantly reducing its coal burn, Germany needs to think about this, obviously, in terms of gas as well. There are differences between nuclear and gas in terms of, as we've discussed before, the huge cost of nuclear and also the commitment, once the cost is made, to what happens then. The point about gas is that to a certain extent, you probably can use it as a transition and then diminish it relatively quickly as renewables and storage and interconnectors and as demand side management ramps up. The problem with nuclear is that once it's there, it's there. So there are differences between these two technologies. But as everybody knows, there's no such thing as a free lunch. We do need to transit to net zero. And this is a hugely complex discussion.
All right. So a complex discussion. But what I understood is there's one or the other argument that could be if we would have to choose between nuclear and gas would be more favorable simply because you do not have to deal with these long-term consequences.
And also, it's completely effective at load balancing, at powering up and powering down.
So it could solve one of the problems, let's say some of the ramp-up problems that we probably will face with renewables, and also the rebuilding of all the grids.
Yes, that's obvious.
So while wrapping this up here, just to come back on one of the main arguments for proponents of nuclear power. One obviously is the geopolitical one that you just mentioned in regards to the crisis at the Ukrainian-Russian border. Another one is simply, it comes down to, and that's one of, like, I think I hear a lot from the corner, for example, from Bill Gates, just to name him here, there is that it's just climate neutral, there's no CO2 emissions. So how true is that?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Ukraine because, of course, there are 15 operating nuclear reactors in Ukraine, and one hopes that the shooting doesn't necessarily impact on them. But in terms of thinking about nuclear and climate, there's various studies. And there are serious and significant studies around this. Now, UNECE published a study quite recently, which sort of states that nuclear's climate CO2 impact is below, significantly below renewables. But when one looks at that study, one sees huge problems with it in the way that it's looked at the life cycle of new nuclear. And also when one looks at the history of the UNECE, one sees that all its publications have been profoundly pro-nuclear. It's a small Swiss UN operation that largely says what it wants to say. There are other substantive studies which also say that nuclear is relatively low carbon at point of generation, which is true. But the problem is this. It's the life cycle of nuclear in terms of uranium mining, transport, processing, operation. Don't even think about accidents and incidents, and obviously decommissioning and waste. And as we speak, I and others are currently working very hard on this and hope to publish within the next 6 months or so.
So that seems to be a complex topic that also depends on who's actually doing the research. I think what maybe we can keep as the bottom line here, though, is that every single euro or dollar that goes into nuclear is missing in renewable energy investments, where it actually would be 4 to 5 times as effective in also just a much shorter time span. And I guess in that sense, nuclear power certainly is not climate neutral because it simply takes away money from a much more effective and important investment.
I think that's absolutely true, and I absolutely agree with that statement.
I think that probably already was the most important takeaway from our conversation today, is that just to understand how much more expensive nuclear is and how much longer it takes to deploy. So there's absolutely no logical reason to use it. We also heard that it does not really help to cover the baseline or to handle grid fluctuations because it takes so long for it to power up. Another really important thing for me to take away is about SMR, so small modular reactors, that it's not really a completely different technology that suddenly makes nuclear safe and manageable. On the contrary, the radiation risks are the same. If you scale it, there's even more problems because you multiply problems if something goes wrong in the supply chain. And it would just mean basically that we have a lot more reactors standing around in this world, facing all sort of uncertainties and unmanageable risks as rising waters, crisis, conflicts, maybe even terrorism. So that was really important to understand that there's not suddenly a brand new technology that turns around everything for nuclear. On the contrary. So there are just really sound arguments to stick to renewables, and the numbers that you threw out there are just mind-blowing. I mean, just the number of deployment in renewables we'll see, the investment that's already going into it make nuclear almost insignificant. So really, thanks a lot for providing us with your very well-researched arguments and giving us some tools in the debate that unfortunately probably will stick around for a bit in this year. Thanks a lot for having joined us today, Paul.
Great. Thank you very much, Zachas. Thank you very much.
You can find out all about the latest developments and trends in a renewable, decentralized and digital energy world on the Smarter E Europe, Europe's largest platform for the energy industry. The Smarter E Europe brings together the 4 exhibitions Intersolar Europe, EES Europe, Power to Drive Europe and eMpower Europe. For more information, visit us online at thesmartere.de.